Close your eyes for a moment and step back in time, way back, to an age before cities, before empires, before even written language. We're about to journey through the world of our ancestors, the hunter-gatherers who lived in a delicate balance with nature. You'll feel the pulse of their daily life, the rhythm of their survival, and witness the moment when everything changed, the birth of agriculture. This is the pivotal moment when humanity's future began to take shape, a choice made in desperation that would forever alter the course of civilization. It is morning. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but you can feel it coming, that first warmth gathering at the edge of the horizon, like a breath being held before release. You are standing with your tribe in a valley whose name no one will ever know. Around you, 15 or perhaps 20 people move, with a quiet purpose that has been honed over countless generations. Some are preparing spears with stone points so finely crafted they catch what little light exists in this dim hour. Others are checking bindings, adjusting leather straps that will secure the tools to their hands. There's a kind of focused silence here, the kind that comes when survival depends on knowing exactly what you're doing. This is the world of the hunter-gatherer. This is where we all come from, and this is the world that is about to change forever, though no one here knows it yet. Your people have lived like this for so long that time itself seems to have stopped. Generation after generation, your ancestors pursued the same rhythms, followed the same patterns, ate from the same lands their parents and grandparents had eaten from. There is comfort in this predictability, even if you've never used that word. You know what the seasons bring. You know where the herds gather. You know which plants are safe to eat and which will bring sickness or death. You know the songs your mother taught you and the stories that explain why the world works the way it does. But there's also something else in the air this morning. A kind of tension. Can you feel it? The hunters around you have caught wind of something on the breeze. Perhaps it's the faint scent of animal blood carried on the wind from valleys you cannot see. Perhaps it's the distant sound of hooves thundering across dry ground, a vibration in the earth that you feel through the soles of your hide-wrapped feet before you hear it with your ears. This hunt matters. It always does. But today it matters in a way that reaches deeper than mere hunger. You are not starving. That's important to understand. Research from anthropologists such as Marshall Salins and Richard B. Lee has challenged popular notions that hunter-gatherer societies were always near the brink of starvation, instead showing that hunter-gatherer tribes were able to meet their needs through working roughly 15 to 20 hours per week or less. The wealth you possess comes not from accumulation, but from modest desires. Hunter-gatherers have a marvellously varied diet based on the abundance of the local flora and fauna. Your people have leisure time. You have moments of rest. You can sit by a fire and tell stories, paint on cave walls, make music, and think about the mysteries of the universe in ways that suggest a sophisticated inner life. But today's hunt is different. The herds that your people have depended on for generations are becoming less reliable. Over the past few hundred years, though you wouldn't measure time in such abstract terms, you've noticed the pattern shifting. The mammoths that once moved through your lands in predictable waves are rarer now. The woolly rhinos that your grandfather's grandfather spoke of in the old stories have become almost legendary. The vast megafauna that once dominated the landscape are disappearing, their slow extinction leaving a vacuum in the world that no one fully understands yet. The morning air is cold. It carries the bite of ice age climate, though the ice sheets themselves are retreating northward. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, you can see your breath crystallizing in front of your face. Your skin is covered in layers of hide and fur, stitched together with sinew using bone needles that represent the height of technological sophistication in your world. Around your neck hangs an ornament, a pierced tooth perhaps, or a carved bone amulet that marks you as a member of your tribe, distinguishes you from the other groups that sometimes cross your territory and sometimes come into conflict with yours. The people around you are your entire world. There might be 50 or 100 of you, spread across a region, moving seasonally in a pattern that has barely changed for thousands of years. You know the face of everyone here. You know their moods, their strengths, their weaknesses. You know who is the best hunter, who has the steadiest hand with a spear, who tells the best stories, who carries the knowledge of medicinal plants, who understands the patterns of the stars. This intimate knowledge, this deep connection to every member of your community, is perhaps something our modern world has lost, traded away for the convenience of larger groups and the anonymity of cities. Your tools surround you. A spear thrower, called an atlatl, which gives you the mechanical advantage to launch a sharp projectile with tremendous force. Knives made from flint, obsidian or bone work to razor-sharp edges through hours of careful knapping. Traps and snares made from cord and wood. Your ancestors have developed these tools through knowledge accumulated over countless generations. Every edge is precisely angled. Every binding is tested and reliable. Your toolkit represents the accumulated knowledge of generations, refined through countless failures and successes. The hunt itself will involve strategy. It's not a matter of simply running after animals and hoping to get lucky. Your people have observed the behaviour of prey, animals for millennia. You understand that herds move in certain ways, that certain terrain funnels them towards particular passes, that they can be driven toward cliffs or into waiting ambush points. This requires communication. It requires planning. It requires the ability to think abstractly about the future and coordinate your actions with others in your group. It requires language, and make no mistake, your language is not primitive. You can speak of things that don't exist, of past events and future possibilities, of spiritual concepts and abstract ideas. You can make jokes, you can lie, you can dream. But as this hunt begins, as the hunters move out into the landscape, something crucial is invisible to you. The world itself is shifting. The climate patterns that have held steady for thousands of years are about to convulse. The animals you've relied on are not just going to become scarcer. Many of them will vanish entirely from the earth. The way of life that has sustained your people since time immemorial is approaching its end. Not suddenly, not with a catastrophic overnight change, but inexorably, like a great wheel slowly turning, grinding the old world to dust and preparing the ground for something entirely new. The hunt disperses across the landscape. Some hunters move east toward a ridge, where the terrain is high and offers vantage points. Others move west toward a river valley, where prey often gathers. There's an old woman who stays behind with the children and the very young. She will tend the fires, keep them alive with carefully preserved embers, if wind or rain threatens to extinguish them. She will prepare the camp for the hunter's return, and she carries with her knowledge that is perhaps more valuable than anything the hunters possess. Knowledge about which plants can be eaten, which ones can heal wounds or ease pain, which ones carry properties that seem to connect human consciousness to the spiritual realm. This is the world at the threshold. This is the moment before everything changes. And to understand the transformation that's about to happen, you need to feel the weight of this world, the solidity of this way of life, because it's only when you truly understand how successful and well adapted the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was that the Neolithic revolution becomes truly remarkable, not as a triumph, but as a kind of desperate experiment, a gamble that would ultimately reshape human civilization, but at costs that would take millennia to fully understand. To understand why your ancestors did what they did, you need to understand the calendar they lived by, not the abstract numerical calendar of our modern world, but a calendar written in the body of the earth itself, in the movements of animals, in the appearance and disappearance of plants, in the position of stars in the night sky. Your year, though you wouldn't call it that, is divided into periods marked by events rather than numbers. There is the time when the herds move through the valley heading north. There is the time when certain fish appear in the rivers. There is the time when specific plants are in seed. There is the time when the air grows cold and the light diminishes. There is the time when it grows warm again. Let me take you through this cycle. Imagine yourself sitting around a fire on a night in what we would call late spring. The hunting season has ended and your people have successfully brought down several large deer. The meat has been partially dried and stored. The group is relaxed, full, content. Children play nearby, making shapes out of stones and sticks. Someone is working on a hide, scraping it with a tool held at precisely the right angle to remove the flesh without tearing the valuable skin. The old storyteller, who might be 35 or 40 years old, making them ancient by the standards of your world, begins to speak. Their voice carries the weight of knowledge passed down through generations. They describe the journey your people will take in the coming months. They speak of landmarks you'll recognise, of the locations where certain plants grow and certain animals can be found. They describe the path in such detail that anyone listening could follow it even in darkness, because this knowledge has been encoded in story and metaphor and song for so long that it has become almost muscle memory. This is not writing. You have no written language, but it is information storage nonetheless. It is a technology, just not one we usually think of as technology. The human mind, particularly when trained and refined through cultural practice, can store astonishing amounts of detailed information when that information is encoded in narrative and melody. There are Aboriginal peoples in Australia whose songlines encode knowledge about the landscape so precise that they can navigate hundreds of miles of desert using songs that describe landmarks, water sources, and the locations of food resources. Your people have similar systems, through a combination of inherited knowledge and your own observations, that the seasons follow patterns. You understand that when shadows fall a certain way, when the sun reaches a particular position on the horizon, certain events will follow with reliable regularity. You know that certain plants will appear only at certain times. You know that animals migrate according to patterns that can be predicted and planned around. This knowledge goes deep. Some of your people can read the sky in a way that seems almost magical to those of us who live under light-polluted skies, surrounded by the glow of electric bulbs. They know the stars. They can navigate by them. They understand that the constellations shift throughout the year, and they've incorporated these shifts into their understanding of the seasons. They know which star rising in the pre-dawn sky means that herds will soon begin moving. They know which star's disappearance from the evening sky means that certain plants will be ready for harvest. The climate of your world has been relatively stable for the past few thousand years. It's the tail end of the last ice age, but the massive ice sheets that once covered much of the northern hemisphere have retreated. The world is warming, slowly, gradually, but undeniably. The climate of your region oscillates between periods that are relatively similar, adapted to patterns that have held for thousands of years. Your people move seasonally. You don't have permanent settlements. Instead, you have multiple camps, places where the group returns regularly at certain times of year when resources are abundant. There might be a summer camp near a river where fish are plentiful. There might be a winter camp in a sheltered valley where the wind is less severe and the hunting is good. There might be seasonal camps where specific resources gather at specific times, places where nuts grow in abundance in the autumn, or where migratory birds pass through in the spring, or where certain roots and tubers are best harvested at particular times. The work of survival is distributed. The men hunt, the women gather. But this division isn't absolute or rigid. Women sometimes participate in hunts, men sometimes gather plants. The distribution of labour reflects practical necessity and perhaps some cultural norms. But there's flexibility. Children learn both sets of skills. Elderly people who can no longer run long distances still contribute through their knowledge and their ability to process and prepare food. And here's something that might surprise you. Your people probably eat better and more reliably than people will eat for the next 9,000 years. The shift to agriculture, which we think of as progress, will actually lead to nutritional decline for several centuries. Your diet, in contrast, is varied and rich. You eat meat from hunted animals. You eat fish from rivers and streams. You eat hundreds of different plants, nuts, seeds, roots, tubers, fruits, berries. You've learned to process certain plants to remove toxins, making nutritious foods accessible that would otherwise be poisonous. You've learned to store foods for the seasons when they're not available. You have a pharmacy of medicinal plants that you use to treat wounds and illnesses. Your population is stable. You have enough children to replace those who die, but not so many that you outstrip your resources. This stability is probably maintained through a combination of natural mechanisms, longer intervals between births, perhaps related to the physical demands of nursing and frequent movement, and through cultural practices that regulate reproduction. There is violence in your world. Make no mistake about that. Disputes over territory, conflicts with neighbouring groups, and internal tensions all occasionally erupt into violence. But this violence is probably not constant or systematic. It's not the scale of organised warfare. It's more like the occasional raid or skirmish between rival groups competing for access to prime hunting or gathering territories. There is also cooperation and mutual aid. Your group shares food. Those who successfully hunt share their catch with those who had poor luck or who cannot hunt. The group pools its knowledge. Everyone contributes to the collective survival. This isn't altruism exactly, it's practical. You know that you're only one illness or injury away from being unable to provide for yourself, and you need to know that your community will support you if that happens. Your spiritual life is rich and complex. You believe in spirits that inhabit the landscape. You believe that animals have agency and intention, that they choose whether to allow themselves to be hunted or not. Before a hunt, you might perform rituals intended to communicate with the spirit of the animal, to ask for permission, to ensure that if the hunt is successful, the animal's spiritual essence is treated with respect. After a successful hunt, there are rituals of gratitude and acknowledgement. Your relationship with nature isn't one of simple exploitation. It's more like a negotiation, a reciprocal relationship in which humans are participants in a larger spiritual ecology. You create art. In caves throughout your world, people are painting animals and handprints and abstract symbols. They're carving bone and ivory into figurines. They're making jewellery from shells and teeth and bone. They're creating music on bone flutes. These are not simple people with simple minds. These are people with imagination, creativity, spiritual depth and aesthetic sensibility. But as this age continues, as decades turn into centuries and centuries into millennia, subtle changes are happening. They're invisible in day-to-day life, but they're accumulating. The great herds of megafauna are declining. The mammoth populations are shrinking. The giant ground sloths that once roamed certain regions are becoming rare. The woolly rhinos are disappearing. The causes are complex and likely involve multiple factors, including human hunting pressure, climate stress, and disease. Your ancestors don't perceive this as a gradual process. They experience it as individual variations. A year when the herds are smaller than usual. A season when a particular plant doesn't fruit as abundantly as it normally does. These variations are accommodated through the flexibility of your lifestyle. You move to different camps. You focus on different resources. Your knowledge base includes multiple options for survival. So when one resource becomes scarce, you shift to another. But what if the variations don't correct themselves? What if the herds continue to dwindle? What if the abundance that characterised the earlier Holocene, the current geological epoch, begins to show signs of ending? That's the situation your ancestors are about to face. The change, when it comes, is almost imperceptible at first, but it accumulates with the weight of inevitability. It's a period we call the Younger Dryas, occurring roughly 12,900 to 11,700 years ago before present. The exact cause of this climate event is debated among scientists, though some researchers propose that a cometary or meteoritic body may have played a role, though this remains contested. The leading theory involves the interruption of the Atlantic Ocean's circulation systems when a massive inundation of glacial meltwater from the retreating North American Laurentide ice sheet entered the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean circulation and leading to rapid cooling in the Northern Hemisphere. The warming trend that had been steadily pushing back the ice sheets suddenly reverses. Imagine what this feels like. You're an elder, perhaps in your 50s, which makes you exceptionally old. You remember the stories your grandmother told you about the times of greater cold, but in your lifetime, the trend has always been toward warmth. The ice is retreating. The world is becoming more habitable in many ways. The climate has been stable enough for your people to build their entire way of life around it. And then something changes. The seasons begin to behave differently. Winters become harsher than anyone living remembers. Springs become less predictable. The herds, sensitive to climate, become erratic in their migrations. They arrive later, or in smaller numbers. Some years they don't come at all. The plants respond too. The vegetation that thrives in your region is adapted to a particular climate. When that climate shifts, the plants struggle. Some years the nuts don't fruit. The roots become scarce. The berries don't ripen. Your people's knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years, about where to find specific resources at specific times, becomes less reliable. You go to a place where tubers have always been abundant, only to find nothing. You arrive at your summer camp expecting fish to crowd the rivers, only to find the waters cold and empty. And here's the crucial part. This isn't a temporary problem. It's not like a single bad year where you adjust, and the next year everything returns to normal. The Younger Dryas is estimated to have lasted 1100 to 1300 years in duration. That's not a lifetime. That's not even 10 lifetimes. It's enough time that the knowledge accumulated over thousands of years becomes partially useless. It's enough time that traditional strategies fail. It's enough time that your people need to find new ways to survive. Imagine the desperation of this, the certainty that has governed your entire existence, the knowledge of the seasons, the predictability of abundance has become unreliable. Your children are asking questions that have no answers. The old stories that explain how the world works seem to be no longer true. The rituals you perform to ensure abundance don't seem to work anymore. Different regions experience this crisis differently. In some places, the impact is catastrophic. The megafauna, roughly 120 species of mammals, experience rapid decline and extinction during the Younger Dryas period. The megafauna that supported human populations collapse entirely. In other places, the impact is less severe. But everywhere, human communities face a challenge they haven't faced before. Their traditional way of life isn't producing enough food. Different groups respond differently. Some groups migrate to find better conditions. Some groups move toward coastal areas where maritime resources, fish, shellfish, sea mammals, become increasingly important. Some groups turn to hunting the smaller animals that are still abundant. Some groups shift their entire subsistence strategy toward plants, spending more time gathering and processing wild plant foods than they ever have before. And some groups try something different. Some groups begin to deliberately intervene in plant growth. They notice that if they save seeds from particularly productive plants and deliberately plant them in certain locations, those plants grow. Some evidence suggests deliberate cultivation of cereals, specifically rye, by the Natufian culture at Tel Abu Huraira, the site of the earliest evidence of agriculture in the world. They notice that if they clear competing vegetation around plants they want to encourage, those plants thrive. They notice that certain plants, when encouraged this way, produce more than they ever do in the wild. The Natufian culture refers to mostly hunter-gatherers who lived in modern-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria approximately 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, merging nomadic and settled lifestyles, and among the first people to build permanent houses and cultivate edible plants. It's not full agriculture yet. It's something in between. It's cultivation without farming. It's the beginning of what we call the transitional period to agriculture. Your ancestors are starting to engineer their environment in new ways, to actively manage plant resources rather than simply harvesting what nature provides. This isn't a sudden inspiration. It's not one person having a brilliant idea that transforms civilization overnight. It's a gradual process of experimenting and observing and learning what works. It's probably multiple groups in different regions making similar discoveries independently. It's human innovation responding to pressure, to crisis, to necessity. But here's what your ancestors don't fully realise yet. This path they're beginning to walk will transform their entire world. The practices they're starting to develop will eventually lead to agriculture, to permanent settlements, to civilization, to all the complexity and inequality and specialization that characterizes human society today. They don't realize that the next 1,000 years will see changes more profound than anything that has happened in human history. They only know that they're hungry. They know that the old ways aren't working. They know that they need to try something new. And so, tentatively, experimentally, they begin. Before we move forward, let's sit with this moment a little longer, because what's happening here is profound in a way that goes beyond simple survival. Your ancestors are facing a choice that isn't really a choice at all. It's more like an inevitable pressure that will bend their path toward a particular direction. The crisis of the Younger Dryas creates a kind of desperation that sparks innovation. The old systems aren't working. The certainties have fallen away. Your people need to find new ways to secure food, and they're intelligent enough and creative enough to begin experimenting with new strategies. But here's something crucial. They don't understand the full implications of what they're starting. No one throughout human history has ever chosen a major lifestyle change because they understood all its future consequences. We never see the long shadows cast by our decisions. We only see the immediate challenge in front of us. When your ancestors save seeds from productive plants and deliberately plant them in favourable locations, they're not thinking about civilization. They're not thinking about cities or kingdoms or organised states. They're thinking about getting enough food to feed their children through a harsh winter. They're thinking about survival. But this small action, this gathering of seeds and deliberate planting, begins a chain of consequences that will unfold over millennia. The plants that humans deliberately protect and encourage begin to evolve differently from their wild cousins. Over generations, selective pressure favours the plants that are easiest for humans to harvest, that produce larger seeds or fruits, that ripen all at once rather than staggered across weeks or months. The plants become more domesticated. They become in a real sense dependent on humans. And as humans invest more time and energy in cultivating these plants, they invest less time in hunting and gathering wild foods. They become more sedentary. Instead of moving seasonally to different camps, they begin to stay in one place longer, watching over their fields, protecting them from animals and competing plants. The ripple effects of this small change are enormous. Sedentary populations can have more children than mobile populations. When you're moving frequently, each adult can only carry a certain amount of burden, including children. Once you stop moving regularly, you can support more offspring. Population increases. More people means more mouths to feed, which creates more pressure to produce food, which means more cultivation, which means more sedentism, which means higher population density, With higher population density comes new problems that didn't exist before. Diseases spread more easily when people live close together. Conflicts over territory and resources become more frequent and more severe when population pressure increases. New forms of social organisation become necessary to manage these larger groups. We're describing something that won't fully be called agriculture for another 1,000 years or more. We're describing a transitional phase. But it's in this transition that the seeds of everything we recognise as civilization are planted. Your ancestors in those early days of experimentation with cultivation probably don't notice the gradual changes. A parent notices that their children don't have to walk as far to gather food. A community notices that they can support more people in the same space. These changes seem like improvements. They solve immediate problems. It's only thousands of years later, when you're living in a crowded city with a rigid social hierarchy, and you're spending 10 hours a day working in fields that someone else owns, that you might wonder if this was truly progress. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to the world as your ancestors are experiencing it. This moment of transition, this crossroads where necessity is beginning to push humanity toward a radically new way of living. Your ancestors are learning something profound. They can shape their world. They can encourage the growth of plants they like. They can modify their environment to suit their needs. This is an enormous psychological shift. Before this moment, humans worked within the constraints of nature. You adapted to what nature provided. Now, for the first time, you're beginning to change nature itself to serve your purposes. This power is intoxicating and terrifying, because the more you invest in cultivating particular plants, the more dependent you become on those plants. If your fields fail, you have no backup. You've already abandoned the nomadic lifestyle that allowed you to move to different areas when local resources were exhausted. Some of your people probably resist this change. The old hunters, the ones who pride themselves on their knowledge of tracking and their skill with weapons, probably resist the idea of settling down and tending fields like women gathering plants. There's probably conflict within communities about whether to pursue this new path or stick with traditional hunting and gathering. But the pressure of the climate crisis is relentless. The Younger Dryas persists. The herds remain sparse. The gathering spots are less productive. Gradually, inexorably, more and more groups adopt cultivation. It starts as a supplement to hunting and gathering, but it slowly becomes the primary source of calories. Different regions of the world are going through similar transitions at roughly similar times, though the specifics vary greatly. It's possible that rye was already domesticated around the period 11,000–10,000 BC at the site of Abu Huraira in modern Syria, with evidence of tilling and cultivating of wild strains of rye and einkorn existing at nearby sites in the same period. Different regions develop agriculture with different plants and animals suited to their local conditions. The process is uneven. In some areas, agriculture becomes the primary subsistence strategy relatively quickly. In other areas, hunting and gathering persist alongside cultivation for centuries. Some communities make the transition and then seem to partially revert to hunting and gathering strategies when agriculture fails or becomes too difficult. There's experimentation, there's failure, there's adaptation and readjustment. Your ancestors in this period are pioneers in the truest sense. They're experimenting with practices that will eventually transform human civilization. They're making choices that seem small and practical and immediate, but that have enormous long-term consequences. They're acting under pressure, responding to climate crisis, trying to survive, and in the process, they're inadvertently setting humanity on a new course. The world that emerges from this transition will be immensely more complex than the one your ancestors knew. It will have cities and armies and writing and elaborate bureaucracies. It will have inequality and slavery and organised warfare on scales previously unknown. It will have incredible artistic and intellectual achievements and profound human suffering. It will be civilization. But that world is still far in the future. For now, your ancestors are simply trying to get through the next difficult season. They're gathering seeds and planting them. They're beginning to live in more permanent settlements. They're starting to organise their lives around the agricultural calendar. They don't know what they're building. They only know that the old world is ending and something new is being born. And in this moment of uncertainty and adaptation and desperate innovation, the future is being written. Not with pen and ink, writing won't exist for several thousand more years, but with the actions of countless humans making small choices in response to necessity. The future is being written in fields of grain and settled villages, and the slow transformation of humanity from nomadic hunter-gatherers into sedentary farmers dependent on the crops they cultivate and the animals they domesticate. This is where it begins. This is the moment when everything changes. This is the threshold we're crossing, leaving behind 10,000 years of human experience and stepping into a radically new world. Picture this. You're standing in a landscape that will one day be called the Fertile Crescent, though that name won't exist for thousands of years. The climate is beginning to stabilise after the trauma of the Younger Dryas. The worst of the crisis has passed, though the certainties have not returned. It's roughly 11,500 years ago, give or take a few centuries. The ice sheets in northern latitudes are retreating further. The world is warming again, slowly but definitively. Your community has made a decision, though it wasn't articulated as such. You're going to stay here. This valley, this particular location, has proven itself to be productive enough to support your people year-round. Instead of moving to different camps with the seasons, instead of following the animals and the ripening of wild plants across the landscape, you're going to settle. You're going to build structures that will last more than a season. You're going to invest in this place. This decision is momentous, though it doesn't feel momentous. It feels practical. The transition has been gradual. 20 years ago, your people might have spent 8 months of the year here and moved to other camps for 4 months. 15 years ago, that ratio shifted to 9 months settled and 3 months mobile. 10 years ago, you stayed most of the year and made only brief forays to visit other camps or to hunt seasonal game. Now, you've stopped moving entirely. The settlement itself is modest by modern standards, but revolutionary for its time. Where once your people lived in temporary shelters that could be packed up and carried when you moved, you now have more substantial buildings. Some of them have stone foundations, some have mud brick walls. They're grouped in a loose cluster, and between them are open areas where people gather, work and socialise. Your own family's house is a modest affair, perhaps 30 feet across at its widest point. It has a central area where the fire is kept, and several smaller rooms where your family sleeps and stores possessions. Unlike the mobile shelters of earlier times, which held little more than what people could carry, this house can store larger quantities of food, tools and other items. This ability to store abundance is crucial. For the first time in human history, you can accumulate supplies. When you harvest grain, you don't have to consume it immediately or share it with your entire community. You can store it in your house in carefully prepared bins that keep it dry and safe from rodents. This creates a new sense of security. It also creates a new sense of property. This grain is yours. This house is yours. This land, this patch where you've cultivated grain for the past several years, is yours and your family's. The shift to permanent settlement brings unexpected challenges. When you were mobile, waste disposal wasn't a problem. You simply moved to a new location, leaving your refuse behind. Now, as you live in one place year-round, your own waste accumulates around your settlement. The ground becomes littered with broken tools, food scraps, discarded clothing. This concentration of human activity in one location attracts animals seeking food scraps. It creates conditions for disease-carrying insects and parasites to thrive. It pollutes water sources. Your people are learning, through trial and error, how to manage these problems. Some groups develop practices of taking refuse to designated areas away from the main settlement. Some groups build new settlements nearby when the accumulated waste becomes too problematic. Some groups develop early forms of sanitation practices, designated areas for human waste, careful management of water sources. The settlement also changes your social structure. When you were a mobile population of 50 or 100 people, your social structure was relatively flat. There were leaders and respected elders, but there wasn't rigid hierarchy. Everyone did roughly the same work: hunting, gathering, making tools, preparing food. Everyone had access to the same resources. Now, as your settlement grows, newcomers are attracted by the abundance of cultivated land. Your society begins to develop more specialization. Some people focus on maintaining and expanding the fields. Some people focus on managing stored grain. Some people focus on craft production, making tools, weaving, pottery. The community begins to develop individuals who are particularly skilled at certain tasks, and those individuals begin to spend less time on other tasks. Along with specialization comes something new: the possibility of unequal distribution of resources. When all food is consumed immediately, and when everyone works at multiple different tasks, inequality is hard to maintain. But when grain can be stored, and when some people are beginning to specialize, a new possibility emerges. The person who manages the grain store might keep a larger share for themselves. The skilled craft person might demand more resources in exchange for their goods. Gradually, distinctions of wealth begin to emerge. You're not living in a rigid hierarchical society yet that will take centuries to develop, but the seeds of hierarchy are being planted. The possibility of organized inequality is taking root. The daily rhythm of life is different from what it would have been even a generation before. Your day doesn't begin with the question, where will we find food today? That question still matters, but it's supplemented by new questions. How are the fields looking? Do we need to clear more competing plants? Are the grain stores secure? Do we have enough water stored? Women's work changes. In the old mobile economy, gathering wild plants was extremely important. In many hunter-gatherer societies, women's gathering provides the majority of calories. But in a settled agricultural economy, women's work shifts toward cultivation, harvesting, and food preparation. They begin to spend more time engaged in labour associated with agriculture. Some scholars suggest this transition actually increased women's workload, even as it may have given them greater access to stored surplus. Children grow up in a different world. In a mobile society, children learn about their entire environment through constant movement and observation. The landscape is your schoolroom. The seasonal migrations are your curriculum. In a settled village, children grow up in a smaller area. They know their immediate surroundings intimately, but they're less exposed to the wider landscape. Their education becomes more formalised, more focused on the specific knowledge needed to survive and thrive in one location. Food itself becomes different. Your ancestors' diet, when based on hunting and gathering, was tremendously varied. They ate hundreds of different plants and animals. But as agriculture develops, the diet often becomes more restricted. A few crops begin to dominate. Grain particularly. The grain provides reliable calories, but it's less nutritious than a varied diet. It lacks certain vitamins and minerals that your ancestors got from a diverse diet of wild foods. Many scholars have noted that when agriculture develops, human nutrition often gets worse before it gets better. Your diet probably becomes more monotonous. Grain is ground into flour and made into bread or porridge. Legumes provide protein. Vegetables are grown in small gardens near houses. Occasionally, meat is eaten from animals that have been domesticated, or from wild game when hunters are successful. But the wild abundance that characterised the old diet is gone, replaced by a more limited palette of cultivated foods. There are sounds that didn't exist before. The sounds of construction, the impact of stone on wood, voices calling out instructions, the grunt of effort as people move heavy loads. The sounds of craft production, the potter's wheel, the loom, the napper striking flint. The sounds of domestic animals, goats bleating, sheep calling, chickens clucking. These sounds mark the transformation from a world where human activity was temporary and ephemeral to a world where human activity is permanent, leaving a constant imprint on the landscape. There are smells too. The smell of smoke rising from many fires concentrated in one place. The smell of stored grain and stored food. The smell of animal waste. The smell of human waste accumulating in designated areas. The smell of cooking, the smell of tanning leather, the smell of pottery kilns. The settlement has a scent that is entirely different from the open landscape. The night looks different too. In a mobile settlement, fires provide light and heat, but they're small, intimate. In a concentrated village with many households, multiple fires burn simultaneously. The night becomes less dark. There's a constant ambient glow from the many fires. The stars are still visible, but they're less prominent than they would be in the complete darkness of the open landscape. Your ancestors are creating something unprecedented in human experience, the permanent human settlement. They're developing building techniques, settlement patterns, and social arrangements that will eventually evolve into cities. They're taking the first steps on a path that will lead to civilization, though they have no conception of what lies ahead. Let's focus now on something that might seem simple, but is actually profoundly complex. the plants that your ancestors are beginning to cultivate. These plants are not accidents. They're not simply any plants that grew wild and were brought under human control. They're specific plants with specific properties that make them particularly suited to cultivation, and that will, over time, become the foundation of human civilization. In the fertile crescent region of your world, though we'll call it that now, even though your people have no such name, the primary crops are wheat and barley. These are cereal grains, plants that produce seeds that are rich in calories and that can be stored for long periods without spoiling. They're perfect for an agricultural strategy because they provide reliable calories that can be accumulated and saved. The story of how wheat became a crop is itself a story of human ingenuity and observation. Wild wheat, the ancestor of domesticated wheat, produces seeds that shatter when they're ripe. The individual grains separate from the stalk and fall to the ground, where they can be blown by wind or collected by animals. From an evolutionary perspective, this shattering is an effective strategy for seed dispersal. But from a human harvester's perspective, it's frustrating. When wild wheat is ready to harvest, many of the grains have already fallen and been lost. However, among the wild wheat plants, there's natural variation. Some plants, due to a genetic mutation, produce seeds that don't shatter. The seeds remain attached to the stalk even after ripening. These mutant plants are rare, but they're visible to human observers. Your ancestors notice them. They collect seeds from these plants preferentially. They save these seeds and plant them. Over many generations, perhaps dozens or hundreds, this selective harvesting leads to a gradual shift. More and more of the wheat grown in your cultivated fields comes from plants that don't shatter. The non-shattering trait becomes dominant in your cultivated grain. The grain is now dependent on humans for reproduction. It can't disperse its own seeds anymore. It's locked in a partnership with humans that will last thousands of years. Barley goes through a similar process. Other grains in other regions, millet in China, sorghum in Africa, undergo similar transformations. The plants and humans co-evolve, each shaping the other, creating a relationship of mutual dependence that's unprecedented in human history. But there's another crucial aspect of grain cultivation, the production of surplus. When you gather wild food, you typically eat what you find. There might be some storage for seasons of relative scarcity, but large surpluses are hard to accumulate. Grain is different. A field of wheat produces a large amount of grain in a concentrated harvest period. If you plant an acre of grain and harvest it efficiently, you can produce more calories in a shorter time than you could by gathering and hunting over an entire season. This grain can be stored. It can be accumulated. The ability to create and store surplus is transformative. For the first time, it becomes possible to support people who don't directly produce food. A religious specialist who spends all their time performing rituals can be supported by the surplus grain produced by farmers. An administrator who spends all their time organising agricultural labour can be supported by that surplus. An artist, a warrior, a priest, anyone who doesn't spend their entire day engaged in food production can now be supported. This possibility of surplus also creates new problems. If grain can be stored and accumulated, it can be taken. A surplus that's carefully stored and protected can be stolen or conquered by force. For the first time, agriculture creates the possibility of organised theft and pillage. If your community has a large stored grain supply and a neighbouring community is hungry, the hungry community might attack and take your grain. This threat of violence over stored resources is probably one of the primary drivers for the development of weapons and defensive strategies. Your ancestors begin to think about protecting their surplus. They might build walls around their settlement. They might develop more effective weapons. They might organise themselves militarily to defend against raids. The grain itself changes the pattern of human labour. The domesticated grain plants require regular maintenance of the fields. Competing plants must be removed. The soil must be prepared for planting. The fields must be harvested in a specific window of time when the grain is ripe. This creates a labour schedule that's quite different from the flexible schedule of hunting and gathering. Your ancestors begin to plan their entire year around the agricultural calendar. The time of ploughing, the time of planting, the time of growth, the time of harvest, the time of processing the grain and storing it. This calendar becomes encoded in ritual and ceremony. Your spiritual life becomes tied to the agricultural cycle. Prayers and rituals are performed at crucial points in the agricultural year, hoping for sufficient water, protection from pests, successful growth and abundant harvest. The grain also changes the relationship with other plants. In a diverse wild landscape, plants that today we call weeds are simply plants growing in their natural habitat. But in a grain field, any plant that's not the cultivated grain is seen as competition, as an obstacle to be removed. Your ancestors begin to develop methods of removing these competing plants, pulling them by hand, using early tools to uproot them, eventually using fire to clear fields. This distinction between cultivated plants and weeds is profound. It represents a new way of categorizing the plant world. Plants are no longer simply plants, each with its own value and properties. Plants are now either useful to humans or obstacles to be removed. This categorization will persist and deepen as agriculture develops. The grain also shapes the landscape itself. Where once there were forests and grasslands, with their full diversity of plants and animals, there are now grain fields. These fields are maintained as monocultures, fields where grain is the dominant plant, and most other plants are removed or discouraged. The diversity of the landscape decreases. The animals that depended on that diverse landscape, insects, birds, small mammals, begin to decline in numbers or disappear entirely. Your ancestors probably don't think of this as environmental destruction. To them, it's progress. It's increasing the productive capacity of the land. It's creating abundance where previously there was only survival. But observers from our modern time, with our understanding of ecology and biodiversity, might see it differently. The flowering of your cultivation strategy is accompanied by a quiet diminishment of the world's diversity. Still, to your ancestors, the grain is a miracle. It's reliable. It produces calories consistently. It can be stored. It can be transported. It transforms human society. And so they invest more and more effort in it. The grain becomes not just a food, but the foundation of a new civilization. But grain alone is not enough to support a settled community. Your ancestors are also beginning to domesticate animals. This process is similar to the domestication of plants, but with an added layer of complexity. Animals are alive. They move. They have needs. they can be dangerous. The relationship between humans and domesticated animals is more complex and more intimate than the relationship between humans and plants. The first animals to be domesticated are probably the ones that already live close to human settlements. Sheep and goats are wild animals that eat vegetation similar to cultivated grain and naturally live in the regions where your people are settling. They're herbivores, which means they eat plants, unlike predators that would require meat. They're relatively docile, which makes them easier to control than more aggressive animals. And they provide multiple resources: meat, milk, hides, wool. The domestication of animals happens gradually, probably starting with semi-wild animals that are tolerated around the settlement. A pregnant wild sheep wanders into the settlement. She gives birth to lambs within the protected space. The lambs grow up accustomed to human presence. Humans begin to control their movements, keeping them from straying too far, preventing them from eating valuable crops, channeling them toward particular grazing areas. Over many generations, as humans selectively breed these semi-tame animals, keeping the animals that are most docile and productive and allowing others to be culled, the animals change. They become smaller, their ears become floppy, their hair becomes woollier, they become increasingly dependent on human care. They lose the survival instincts of their wild ancestors. They can no longer survive without human protection and care. Your people begin to use these animals in new ways. Sheep provide meat, a crucial resource for communities whose diet is increasingly dependent on grain and that need protein. Sheep provide milk, which can be drunk directly or converted into cheese or yogurt, providing additional nutrition and a way to preserve milk's nutrients. Sheep provide wool, which your people have recently learned to spin into thread and weave into cloth. Sheep provide hides for leather. Even their dung is useful, dried and burned as fuel or spread on fields to increase soil fertility. Goats are similar to sheep, perhaps even more versatile. They're excellent at eating a variety of plants, including tough woody vegetation that sheep won't eat. They're hardy and can survive on marginal land. They're more productive breeders than sheep, producing more offspring per generation. In your world, goats might actually become more important than sheep in many regions. Other animals are also being domesticated at this same historical period. In different regions of your world, different animals are being brought under human control. Cattle are being domesticated in regions where they're found wild. Pigs are being domesticated in various locations. Horses in the Eurasian steppes will eventually become crucial to human civilization. Dogs, which might have been partially associated with humans even before the Neolithic transition, are fully domesticated by this time, serving as hunting companions and guards. But there's something crucial happening here that your ancestors might not fully recognise. By controlling reproduction of these animals, by selectively breeding for traits that humans find valuable, humans are actually causing these animals to evolve. They're shaping the genetic makeup of these species. The domesticated sheep is not the same species as the wild sheep. It's different at a genetic level, shaped by millennia of human selection. The animals in return are shaping human society. Your people are increasingly tied to their animals. You must care for them regularly. You must ensure they have water and pasture. You must protect them from predators. You must manage their reproduction. You must harvest the resources they provide. As your herds grow, they become increasingly valuable perhaps the most valuable resource your community possesses. This creates a new form of wealth. An individual or family that owns many animals is wealthy. An individual or family with few animals is poor. The distribution of animals within your community begins to create gradations of wealth and status. This is a significant shift from the relatively egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies of the past. There's also a change in the relationship between humans and wild animals. When your ancestors were primarily hunters, there was a kind of balance. Wild animals were food, but they were also independent beings with their own agency. There were rituals and beliefs that acknowledged animals as spiritual entities, deserving of respect. Now, as domesticated animals become increasingly important, the relationship shifts. Domesticated animals are seen as property. They exist to serve human purposes. The wild animals that compete with humans, or that might prey on domesticated animals, are increasingly seen as threats to be eliminated. Your world begins to divide into categories: domesticated animals and wild animals, useful creatures and dangerous creatures, animals that are controlled and animals that are free. This categorization mirrors and perhaps influences the growing distinction in human society between civilized, sedentary, agricultural, and savage, mobile, hunting-based. The animals also change the landscape. Herds of sheep and goats eat vegetation. When population densities become high, their grazing can denude landscape. Areas that once had forests or dense grasslands can become semi-arid if animal herds are too numerous. In some regions, overgrazing by domesticated animals contributes to the transformation of landscapes, sometimes creating conditions more favourable for continued grazing by preventing the return of woody vegetation, and sometimes creating wastelands where neither wild nor domestic animals thrive well. There's also a disease aspect. As humans and animals live more closely together, diseases jump between species more frequently. Some animal diseases become human diseases. Some human diseases adapt to animal hosts. This creates new health challenges for both humans and domesticated animals. Plagues and epidemics will become more common as humans live in closer contact with domesticated animals and with each other. Yet for your ancestors, these animals represent progress. They provide reliable resources. They can be accumulated. They can be traded. They become, in a real sense, a form of wealth that can be inherited and passed down through generations. The animals, along with the grain fields and the permanent settlement, form the foundation of the new agricultural economy. As your settlement develops, as grain fields are cultivated and herds are managed, something profound is happening to your society that many of your ancestors might not fully perceive. The egalitarian structure of hunter-gatherer societies is slowly being replaced by something more hierarchical. Inequality is being born from the possibilities created by agricultural abundance. Imagine a council meeting in your village. This would have happened in hunter-gatherer societies too. Decisions are made collectively, or at least leaders discuss important matters with other community members. But the content of the meeting has changed. Where once the discussion might have been, where should we hunt? When should we move to the next camp? Now it's, how much of the grain surplus should be stored? Who will manage the storage? How much seed should be saved for next year's planting? Who decides how the animals are distributed? These are new questions, and they create new possibilities for power and control. The person who manages the grain stores has significant power. They control access to a crucial resource. They can decide who gets more and who gets less. They can favour their allies and punish their enemies by controlling access to grain. The same is true for the person who manages breeding and herds. The person who controls which animals breed and which are slaughtered, who receives which animals, can build a power base. People who want animals might offer gifts or favours to stay in the good graces of the person with power over animals. The person who is a skilled craft worker, who knows how to make particularly high quality pottery or tools, gains status and perhaps material rewards for their skills. The person who claims special knowledge about rituals or spiritual matters gains power through that knowledge. For the first time in human history, individuals can accumulate more resources than they need to survive. A family with a large grain store and a large herd can accumulate more than they could possibly consume themselves. This excess can be converted into power in several ways. First, it can be converted into gifts. The person with surplus can give gifts to other community members. In many societies, gift giving creates obligation. The person who receives a gift feels indebted to the person who gave it. By distributing gifts, an individual can create networks of obligation and loyalty. This is called clientage, relationships in which one person is dependent on another for support and protection. Second, it can be converted into marriage alliances. Families with surplus resources can arrange marriages with other families, solidifying alliances. A family with many animals can offer a large bride wealth, a gift of animals given to the bride's family as part of marriage arrangements. This increases their status and creates alliance networks. Third, it can be converted into religious authority. A person who controls surplus resources can commission rituals or construct religious monuments. They can claim that their wealth and power are signs of divine favour. They can use religious authority to justify and maintain their power. Fourth, it can be converted into warriors. A person with surplus resources can employ other people to serve them, protecting their property, conducting raids on behalf of the powerful person, or simply standing as displays of the wealthy person's power and influence. These early forms of military organisation probably develop from these wealth-based relationships. Gradually, over centuries, what was once a relatively egalitarian society becomes increasingly hierarchical. There are rich families and poor families. There are families with many animals and families with few. There are families whose ancestors were skilled craft workers or religious leaders and who continue to hold high status. There are families who are successful in raids or who accumulated resources early and who continue to hold advantages. The ideology that justifies this inequality also develops. Your people begin to believe that some people are naturally suited to lead and others to follow. They believe that some people are born with greater abilities or closer connections to spiritual forces. They believe that inequality is natural and inevitable. But here's something important. This transition from equality to inequality is probably not experienced as oppressive by those living through it. It's gradual. Each step seems reasonable, justified by circumstances. The respected elder, who has accumulated more resources, should probably have some say in how the surplus is managed. The person with special knowledge should probably receive special benefits. The warrior who protects the community should probably receive a larger share of resources. It's only when you step back and look at the process over centuries that you see the profound transformation. The society that was egalitarian at the beginning is becoming hierarchical by the end. The society that made decisions collectively is becoming one where decisions are made by leaders and followed by followers. Your people are also developing new forms of conflict. In hunter-gatherer societies, conflict is usually personal or small group based, a dispute between individuals or between small groups. But as wealth becomes concentrated and social hierarchy develops, conflicts become more about competition for resources and power. Raids become more organised. Groups form alliances. Fortifications begin to be built. Some settlements begin to be fortified, surrounded by walls or ditches, designed to protect against raids. This is a profound change. The settlement, which was once simply a place where people lived, becomes a defensive position. The inhabitants are not just living together, they're defending themselves against external threats. This also suggests that not all settlements are successful. Some settlements are raided and destroyed by neighbours seeking resources or seeking to expand their control. The archaeological record shows clear signs of violent destruction at some early settlements. Evidence of fires, weapons embedded in walls, human remains showing signs of trauma. The emergence of writing, which happens later but which we can mention here as a sign of increasing complexity, is closely tied to the management of stored resources. Some of the earliest writing we find is not poetry or philosophy or history. It's accounting, lists of grain stored, records of animals, lists of workers and their rations. Writing emerges as a tool to manage the complexity of an increasingly stratified society with significant accumulated resources that need to be tracked and controlled. Your ancestors are building the first civilizations. They don't have that term yet, but they're developing the characteristics that will define civilization. Permanent settlements, agriculture producing surplus, specialised labour, hierarchy and social inequality, perhaps early forms of government and law, perhaps organised religion, warfare and defences. All of this emerges from the basic decision to settle down and cultivate grain instead of hunting and gathering. All of this flows from the crisis of climate that forced your ancestors to innovate, to experiment, to find new ways of surviving. The transformation is not complete yet. For centuries more, many human communities will live in ways that blend hunting and gathering with cultivation. But the direction is clear. The future belongs to agriculture. The future belongs to settled civilization. The world that your ancestors created through these choices will eventually encompass most of the globe. Let's step into the daily life of your ancestors as they live in one of these early settlements, now several hundred years into the agricultural transition. The Younger Dryas is long past. The climate has stabilised into something resembling what we know as the modern climate. The settlement has grown. There are perhaps 200 or 300 people living here, distributed among multiple family clusters, each with their own houses and fields nearby. Your day begins before dawn. There's no electricity here, no artificial light. Your only light is fire, so your days follow the sun. As the first light appears on the horizon, people begin to wake. The fires from the previous night are still burning. Someone carefully tends them, adding dry wood to build up the flames, before the community truly stirs. You can hear the animals first. The roosters crow, birds that have been domesticated and are now common around settlements. The goats bleat. The sheep make their gentle calls. The dogs bark. These sounds have become so much a part of the background of life that you probably don't consciously notice them anymore, but they define the acoustic environment of your world. The smell of smoke is thick. Multiple fires burn throughout the settlement. You can also smell animals, the musky scent of goats and sheep and their accumulated manure. You can smell cooking, grain being prepared for the morning meal. You can smell human waste from the designated areas away from the settlement. These smells, both pleasant and unpleasant, are the constant atmospheric reality of settled life. The morning meal is modest. Probably grain, possibly made into a kind of porridge or bread. Perhaps some vegetables from the garden growing near your house. If an animal was recently slaughtered, there might be meat. If there's a lactating goat, there might be milk. Water, or perhaps a fermented drink, is available. The meal might take an hour to prepare and eat. Then work begins. The work differs depending on the season and your role in society. If you're a farmer, and most people are, your work follows the agricultural calendar. In spring, there's land preparation. The fields must be cleared of the plants that grew there last season, or that have sprouted in the off-season. This is intensive labour. Perhaps a wooden plough is used, a simple tool that scratches the earth without turning it, breaking it up for planting. The plough might be pulled by human power, or, if your community has adopted oxen or cattle, pulled by animals. The process of preparing fields is communal. Multiple families work together. One family might control the fields nominally, but the work of preparing them involves many people. This creates a form of social obligation. If you help someone prepare their fields, they'll help you prepare yours. This creates networks of interdependence and mutual obligation. Planting comes next. Seeds are carefully distributed. Different crops might be planted in different fields. Grain is the primary crop, but there might also be legumes, lentils, chickpeas, that provide protein and have the added benefit of replenishing nitrogen in the soil. The legumes might be grown in rotation with grain, alternating fields year to year. The work of planting involves careful pacing. Too much seed in one area and the plants are crowded and unproductive. Too little and the space is wasted. Your ancestors have developed knowledge about how much seed to plant based on their understanding of soil, moisture, and expected germination rates. This knowledge is not written down, it's passed orally from parent to child, encoded in stories and practices. Once planted, the crops require attention. Throughout the growing season, competing plants, weeds, must be removed. This is constant labour, particularly in early summer. Your people spend hours pulling weeds from the fields, clearing space for the grain to grow. This is probably primarily women's work, though anyone might do it. You might work in the fields from sunrise, taking a break at midday when the sun is highest and the heat most intense. During the midday break, you might return to the settlement and eat a meal. Perhaps you rest for an hour in the shade. Then back to the fields for the afternoon work until sunset, or when the light becomes too dim to work safely. The agricultural calendar also dictates other activities. There are times when irrigation is necessary. Channels must be maintained to bring water to fields. There are times when harvesting equipment must be prepared. There are times when storage containers must be built to hold the harvest. Your people have learned to construct specialised tools for different agricultural tasks. Sickles, curved blades used to cut grain, are made from flint or bone set into wooden handles. Winnowing baskets are woven to separate grain from chaff. Grinding stones are specially selected and maintained to process grain into flour. Each of these tools represents accumulated knowledge about the best design for specific purposes. But you're not a farmer alone. Your settlement also needs craftspeople. Someone must make pottery. Pottery vessels are essential for storing grain, for storing and cooking water, for preparing and storing food. The potter sits at a wheel. If your settlement has adopted the pottery wheel, which develops gradually, or hand builds vessels from clay, this work is skilled and requires years of practice to master. Someone must work hides and produce leather. Leather is needed for clothing, for carrying vessels, for bindings and straps. Someone must be skilled at this work, capable of treating and working the hides to produce supple, durable leather. Someone must produce tools, stone and bone tools, wooden implements, handles for axes and hoes. Someone must maintain and sharpen the tools that are constantly dulling or breaking with use. Someone must know how to select appropriate wood for different purposes, how to shape it, how to fasten it together. There are also specialist religious practitioners. Someone claims to have special knowledge of rituals and spiritual matters. They might spend their time performing ceremonies, making offerings to spiritual entities, interpreting omens. This person doesn't directly produce food, but is supported by the surplus of others who believe in the value of their spiritual work. There might also be a healer, someone with knowledge of plants that heal, of techniques to reduce fever or pain, of ways to treat wounds. This knowledge is valuable, and the healer is supported even if they don't directly engage in food production. As the day progresses toward evening, the work patterns shift. The intense sun of midday becomes the gentler light of late afternoon. If you've been working in fields, you might be wrapping up work. You might be moving animals, herding sheep or goats to new pasture, bringing them closer to the settlement for the night. The evening meal is similar to the morning meal, but perhaps larger. As the sun sets, visibility drops dramatically. Work becomes difficult. Your people gather around fires. This is when storytelling happens, when children are taught, when community decisions are discussed. There's music sometimes, instruments made from bone and wood and animal parts. There's conversation and the transmission of knowledge orally from one generation to the next. Sleep comes early. There's no electricity to extend the productive day. When darkness falls and the firelight is limited, the natural inclination is to sleep. Your people probably sleep in multiple shifts, or perhaps just sleep when the night is deepest, waking as dawn approaches. The rhythm of daily life is tied to the sun. It's tied to the seasons. It's tied to the agricultural calendar. It's completely different from the rhythm of hunter-gatherer life, which was more flexible, more tied to the movement of animals and the ripening of plants rather than to a fixed calendar. This regular rhythm of work, week after week, month after month, year after year, creates a different kind of consciousness. Your ancestors are learning to think in terms of cycles. They're learning patience. They're learning to delay gratification, to invest work now in the expectation of reward later. They're learning to think of time differently, not as the constant present of hunter-gatherer consciousness, but as planned sequences of events. Your ancestors don't separate the spiritual and the material the way modern people do. Their religion is woven through all aspects of life. But as their life changes, their spiritual beliefs and practices change too. The hunter-gatherer religions of the past were probably focused on animals and the spirit world. There were likely shamanic practitioners who entered altered states and communicated with animal spirits. There were likely beliefs about the spiritual essence of animals and the need to respect and honour them when they were killed for food. As your people become farmers, their spiritual focus shifts. The land itself becomes sacred. The fields are not neutral spaces, they're inhabited by spiritual forces that can help or hinder the growth of crops. Water becomes sacred, not just as a practical necessity, but as a spiritual force that must be honoured and carefully managed. The grain itself becomes sacred. The first planting ceremony probably involves ritual actions intended to ensure good growth. There might be an offering made to spiritual forces before planting begins. There might be a prayer or chant recited as seeds are scattered on the ground. As the grain grows, there might be periodic ceremonies to ensure its health, protecting it from pests, ensuring sufficient water, invoking spiritual forces to help the plants grow strong. The harvest ceremony is probably the most important ritual of the agricultural year. When the grain is ready, before the harvest begins, there's a ceremony acknowledging the grain's spiritual nature, giving thanks to the forces that enabled its growth and asking permission to harvest it. The first sheaves of grain cut might be treated specially, perhaps bundled and tied in a particular way, perhaps left in the field as an offering, perhaps incorporated into the first bread made from the new harvest. There's probably a ceremony marking the storage of the harvest. The grain, as it's brought in and stored, is treated with a kind of reverence. It's not simply food, it's the manifestation of spiritual forces, the gift of the gods, or spiritual entities that inhabit the landscape. New religious specialists emerge. The farmer priest, who knows both the practical details of agriculture and the spiritual beliefs and ceremonies associated with it. This person becomes increasingly important. They're seen as having special knowledge, special relationship with spiritual forces. They're supported by the community surplus. There might be religious monuments built, structures that have no obvious practical purpose, but are built to honour spiritual forces. Simple stone altars might be created. Perhaps small shrines are built where offerings are placed. Perhaps certain locations, a spring or a particular tree or a high place, are marked as sacred. As your settlements grow and become more complex, organised, religion probably develops. There might be regular calendrical rituals, ceremonies tied to specific times of year. There might be priesthoods, groups of people dedicated to religious practice, supported by the community's surplus, responsible for performing the ceremonies that are believed to ensure the fertility of the land and the well-being of the community. Religious authority becomes intertwined with political authority. The person who claims to have the best relationship with spiritual forces, the person who can most effectively intercede with the gods to ensure good harvests, gains political power. They can claim that their leadership is divinely ordained. They can use religious ceremony to reinforce social hierarchy. They can use the prestige of religious authority to justify demands for surplus. The spiritual beliefs also encode practical knowledge. The ceremony that ensures good harvests might include practical advice about crop management. The ritual of honouring the grain at harvest might include practical instructions about how to thresh it effectively. The spiritual and the practical are not separated. They're merged together. What appears to be purely religious is also a transmission of practical knowledge encoded in sacred forms. There's also a spiritual transformation in how your people think about nature itself. In the old hunting and gathering religions, nature was seen as populated by spiritual forces that were respected and negotiated with. Nature was powerful and humans were embedded within it. But as agriculture develops, the spiritual ideology shifts. Humans begin to see themselves as separate from and superior to nature. They're not simply taking what nature provides, they're actively reshaping it. The land must be subdued, controlled, made productive. The spiritual forces must be persuaded or coerced into ensuring crops grow. This shift in spiritual ideology mirrors a shift in practical relationship. Where once your ancestors worked within natural systems, adapting to them, they now work to reshape natural systems to suit human purposes. The fields are artificial environments maintained against the natural tendency of the land to produce diverse plant growth. The animals are controlled and shaped to meet human needs. Humans are asserting power over nature in unprecedented ways. The spiritual beliefs legitimate this transformation. The gods want humans to be successful, to thrive. The gods want the land to be productive. The spiritual forces support human dominance over nature. This spiritual ideology will persist and develop over thousands of years. Eventually it will lead to religions that explicitly place humans at the centre of creation, that see nature as existing for human use, that teach that humans have the right or even the obligation to reshape the natural world. But in these early days of agriculture, the spiritual transformation is still subtle. Your ancestors still maintain respect for nature and spiritual forces, but the direction is clear. The relationship is shifting from humans adapting to nature to humans reshaping nature to suit human purposes. The invention of agriculture didn't happen just once and then spread smoothly across the world. Instead, agriculture was invented independently multiple times in different regions. The processes were similar, such as population pressure, climate change, human ingenuity, but the specific plants and animals involved varied based on what was available locally. In the Fertile Crescent, we've seen wheat and barley being domesticated alongside sheep and goats. But in other regions, the story is different. In China, millet is being domesticated in the north and rice in the south. Different animals are adapted to local conditions. Pigs in China, different combinations of animals in different regions. In Mesoamerica, thousands of miles away from the Fertile Crescent, agriculture is developing from a different set of starting plants. The key crop will eventually be maize, corn, but also beans and squash. These crops have different growth patterns and different nutritional profiles than the wheat and barley of the Old World. In other regions, Africa, the Pacific Islands, the Americas, agriculture develops later or in different forms. Some regions adopt agriculture earlier. Some regions persist in hunting and gathering for much longer. Some regions develop mixed strategies, combining agriculture with hunting and gathering. Within regions where agriculture is developing, it doesn't spread uniformly. Hunter-gatherers who have adopted agriculture exist alongside hunter-gatherers who haven't. There's gradual diffusion, adjacent communities adopting agricultural practices, learning from their neighbours. There's also conflict and displacement, agricultural communities producing surplus and population that can support warriors, sometimes expand militarily and push out hunter-gatherer communities. The process of agricultural expansion over thousands of years is complex and varied, but the general pattern is clear. Agriculture, despite its difficulties, despite the fact that it sometimes led to nutritional decline and increased disease burden, was more productive than hunting and gathering in most environments. Agricultural communities could support larger populations. They could produce surplus. They could accumulate wealth and power. Over centuries and millennia, agricultural communities became increasingly dominant. Hunter-gatherer communities were displaced or pushed to marginal lands. In many regions, populations that had practiced hunting and gathering for tens of thousands of years switched to agriculture in a matter of a few centuries, as the options available to them changed. The spread of agriculture is also the spread of a particular cultural and technological package. Agriculture comes with a particular type of settlement pattern, sedentary or semi-sedentary. It comes with particular tools, ploughs, hearse, axes. It comes with particular types of social organisation, hierarchy, specialisation, organised religion. As agricultural communities expand and agricultural practices spread, they bring this entire package of cultural, technological and social practices with them. Your ancestors, who lived in early agricultural settlements, don't see themselves as inventing something that will eventually transform the entire world. They're just trying to feed their families and communities. But their choices, replicated across thousands of communities over millennia, create a cascade of changes that will eventually encompass most of the world. The invention of agriculture is often called the Neolithic Revolution, using the term revolution to suggest the profound and far-reaching nature of the changes it causes. But it's a slow revolution, taking place over centuries and millennia. It's a revolution in which most people aren't consciously aware they're revolutionising anything. They're simply adapting to changed circumstances and making choices that seem practical and reasonable in the moment. Yet the cumulative effect is profound. Over the next 1,000 years, agriculture becomes increasingly dominant. Over the next 3,000 years, the first cities and organised states emerge. Over the next 5,000 years, writing, monumental architecture, and organised warfare on unprecedented scales develop. All of this flows from the basic decision to settle down and cultivate grain. Before we close our journey, we need to speak honestly about the costs of the agricultural revolution. Modern people often think of the shift to agriculture as progress, a positive development that moved humanity forward. And in some ways, it was. Agriculture supported larger populations. It allowed for specialisation and the development of arts and crafts and science. It created the foundation for civilization, with all the achievements and glories that civilization has produced. But there were also significant costs, and it's important to acknowledge them. First, nutritional costs. We've mentioned this already, but it bears repeating. The diverse diet of hunter-gatherers, with hundreds of different plants and animals, was generally more nutritious than the grain-focused diet of early farmers. Analysis of bones and teeth from ancient skeletons shows that early farmers on average, were less healthy than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. They suffered more from deficiency diseases. They had more evidence of malnutrition. They were, on average, shorter and more prone to disease. This nutritional decline probably lasted for centuries. Eventually, as agricultural societies became more complex and trade networks developed, access to diverse foods improved. But in the initial transition, many people became less healthy and less well nourished than they had been before. Second, disease costs. Sedentary populations living in close proximity to each other experience disease transmission at rates far higher than mobile populations. Tuberculosis, which was probably rare or absent in pre-agricultural societies, became common in agricultural societies. Diseases that jump from domesticated animals to humans, zoonotic diseases, emerged. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and other waterborne diseases became more common in settled communities. The population of early agricultural settlements was probably affected by periodic epidemics that killed significant percentages of the community. The domestication of animals necessary for agriculture to succeed comes with a disease cost. Many of the diseases that now plague humanity have animal origins. Measles may have come from cattle. Smallpox may have come from horses or cattle. Influenza comes from birds and pigs. Whooping cough may have come from cattle or pigs. Living in close proximity to domesticated animals increased disease transmission between species. Third, labour costs. We've mentioned that hunter-gatherers probably worked only 15 to 20 hours per week. Early farmers often worked 40-60 hours per week or more. The work was more repetitive. The work was more tied to a fixed calendar. There was less freedom. The work was harder on the body. Increased rates of arthritis and joint disease are evident in skeletons of early farmers compared to hunter-gatherers. Fourth, environmental costs. The shift from diverse landscapes to monoculture grain fields led to loss of biodiversity. Forests were cleared, grasslands were ploughed. The diversity of plant and animal species in agricultural regions was reduced. This wasn't catastrophic on a global scale. Hunting and gathering persisted in many regions, but locally, the environmental transformation was significant. Fifth, social costs. The development of hierarchy and inequality led to new forms of human suffering. Slavery emerged. Organised warfare became more common and more violent. The ability to accumulate surplus created the possibility of theft and conquest. Wars over land and resources became more common. Populations that resisted agricultural societies and maintained hunting and gathering ways of life were sometimes violently displaced. Sixth, psychological and spiritual costs that are harder to quantify. The tight relationship between humans and nature that characterized hunter-gatherer spirituality was disrupted. Humans began to see themselves as separate from and superior to nature. The diverse spiritual beliefs and practices of hunter-gatherer societies were gradually displaced by more organized hierarchical religions that often emphasized human dominance and control. The loss of leisure time and the increase in work created different consciousness. Instead of the flexible, present-focused consciousness of hunter-gatherers, agricultural people developed a more future-focused, planning-oriented consciousness. This had benefits in terms of ability to defer gratification and plan complex tasks, but it also brought stress and anxiety about the future in ways that hunter-gatherers probably didn't experience as acutely. However, and this is important, it's not accurate to see the transition to agriculture as a catastrophe or a straightforward decline. Yes, there were real costs, but there were also real benefits. Agricultural societies could support more people. They could support specialists who worked on knowledge, art, and spiritual practice. They eventually developed medicine and science and technology that reduced disease and extended human life. They developed writing and record keeping that allows knowledge to be preserved and built upon. Agricultural societies developed the capacity for remarkable cultural achievements: art, music, literature, philosophy, science. They developed complex ethical systems and legal codes. They created monuments and institutions that have lasted thousands of years. So, the transition to agriculture is neither simply progress nor simply decline. It's a mixed transformation. It brought costs and benefits. It created new forms of human suffering and new forms of human flourishing. It's probably fair to say that the shift to agriculture made life more difficult for average people in some ways and easier in other ways. It created new possibilities for human achievement and new forms of human oppression. Most importantly, it set human civilization on a particular path. Once agriculture was adopted on a large scale, it became difficult or impossible to return to hunting and gathering. Populations became too large. Land was cleared and couldn't easily be returned to wild state. The skills and knowledge for hunting and gathering were lost. Agricultural societies, by their success in supporting large populations, essentially made the reversion to hunting and gathering impossible for most of the world. Your ancestors in that early settlement, carefully cultivating grain and managing their herds, had no way of knowing what they were setting in motion. They couldn't have foreseen the cities and empires and organised states that would eventually develop from their simple choices to settle down and farm. They couldn't have anticipated the diseases and the wars and the inequality that would emerge. They simply knew that they needed to feed their families and communities. They adapted to changed circumstances. They made choices that seemed practical and reasonable in the moment, but their choices, replicated across centuries and millennia by millions of people in different regions around the world, shaped the destiny of human civilization. They created the foundation on which everything that follows would be built. They ended one chapter of human history, the chapter of hunting and gathering that had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, and opened a new chapter of settled civilization that would eventually encompass almost the entire world. As we step back from this intimate view of your ancestors' lives, it's worth reflecting on what we've witnessed. We've traced the transformation from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled farmers, a shift so profound that it reshaped human civilization forever. This transformation wasn't inevitable. If climate had remained stable, agriculture might never have developed. If the Younger Dryas hadn't occurred, if the megafauna hadn't declined, if environmental pressure hadn't mounted, your ancestors might have continued hunting and gathering indefinitely. Different choices, different circumstances would have led to a completely different world. But pressure did mount. Climate did change. Your ancestors did adapt. And in adapting, they set human society on a path toward increasing complexity, larger populations, organised states, and all the achievements and tragedies that follow. We often think of history as the story of great leaders and dramatic events. We think of history as happening at the level of kings and kingdoms and nations. But history also happens at the level of daily choices by ordinary people. It happens through the accumulation of small decisions, to plant seeds instead of gather wild foods, to stay in one place instead of move, to accumulate surplus instead of share everything immediately. Your ancestors didn't make these decisions thinking they were making history. They were responding to immediate circumstances. They were trying to survive. They were trying to provide for their families. They were doing what seemed necessary and practical in the moment. Yet their choices echoed through time. Every person who has ever lived in a city, every person who has worked in fields, every person who has been caught up in organised states and hierarchies and institutions, all of this flows from choices made thousands of years ago by people in settlements that have long since turned to dust. There's a particular kind of responsibility in that realisation. The choices our ancestors made, often without conscious intention or knowledge of consequences, shaped the world we live in today. We inherit not just the benefits of agriculture and civilization, the knowledge, the technology, the art, but also the structures of inequality, the patterns of environmental disruption, the hierarchies and oppressions that developed from those early choices. At the same time, understanding this history of transformation helps us see that the world is not static. It's not the natural or inevitable way things must be. Different choices could have led to different outcomes. Different circumstances could have produced different paths. If we understand how the world came to be the way it is, we might have more capacity to imagine and create different futures. Your ancestors faced a crisis, climate change, the disappearance of megafauna, the pressure of population. They responded with innovation, with adaptation, with experimentation. They weren't always right. They couldn't foresee all the consequences, but they showed the capacity to change, to adapt, to try new approaches when old ways no longer worked. That same capacity exists in us. We face our own crises, climate change, resource depletion, environmental disruption. We have the capacity, as our ancestors did, to adapt, to innovate, to try new approaches. We have more knowledge than they did. We have more technology, but we also have the same fundamental challenges. The need to survive, to provide for our communities, to adapt to circumstances beyond our control. Understanding how agriculture transformed human society, understanding both its benefits and its costs, might help us navigate our own challenges more thoughtfully. It might help us see that the choices we make have long echoes. It might help us think about what kind of future we want to create and what choices we need to make to get there. For now, though, let's allow our ancestors to rest. We can feel gratitude for their innovations, even as we acknowledge the complexities and difficulties their choices created. We can honour the ingenuity they displayed in response to crisis. We can sit with the recognition that we, too, are ancestral to someone in the future. Our choices, like theirs, will echo through time. Our decisions will shape possibilities for people we will never know. The story of agriculture is the story of humanity. It's the story of adaptation and innovation. It's the story of responses to pressure and crisis. It's the story of choices made in moments of uncertainty that have consequences resonating through millennia. Your ancestors looked at a changing world, and they adapted. They were the bridge between two epochs of human civilization. And understanding their transformation helps us understand not just our past, but ourselves and the choices we face in the present. As we bring this journey to a close, I invite you to return slowly to the present moment. The settlement where your ancestors lived has long since been covered by dust and soil and the vegetation that has reclaimed the land. The people we've walked with are long dead, their bones turned to dust, their names and individual stories lost to time. But their legacy surrounds us. The grain that has fed billions of human beings traces its ancestry to the wild wheat that your ancestors first began to cultivate. The animals we keep as companions and for food descend from the animals your ancestors first domesticated. The structures of society we live in, cities, states, hierarchies, specialization, all trace their roots to the changes your ancestors set in motion. The consciousness that emerged as your ancestors adapted to settled agricultural life, the consciousness that plans for the future, that accumulates surplus, that thinks in abstract time units, that consciousness shaped human civilization and persists in us today. As you drift towards sleep, carrying the knowledge of your deep history, remember that you are part of an unbroken chain of human experience stretching back through your ancestors to those first farmers and beyond. The choices they made, the adaptations they developed, the innovations they created, all of that flows through you. And you too are making choices that will echo into the future. You too are adapting to circumstances. You too have the capacity to innovate and transform. Rest now with the knowledge of your ancestry. Rest with the understanding of how far humanity has travelled since those first cultivated fields. Rest with the recognition that you are connected through deep time to all the humans who came before you and to all the humans who will come after. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the deep history of human civilization. If you found this story meaningful, if it helped you feel connected to the vast expanse of human time, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue creating these immersive historical journeys. I'm curious to hear where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Leave a comment below and let me know. There's something profound about realizing that people all around the world are taking this journey into history together, across time zones and distances, united in our curiosity about where we come from and how we got here. Sleep well, knowing that you carry within you the legacy of 10,000 years of human innovation, adaptation, and survival. You are part of a story that stretches back to the beginning of human consciousness and forward into the future. That story continues through you.